The smoke-filled air of the galactic hub's most notorious watering hole, the fractured nebula, shimmered under the weight of heavy bass beats. Neon lights flickered sporadically, casting shadows across a sea of alien patrons, drunken, rowdy, and some teetering dangerously close to chaos. Among them sat a human named Jackson Cade, nursing a glass of some fluorescent blue liquid that hissed and steamed ominously. Jackson wasn't just any human. He was an ex-military drifter, a war veteran whose skills were equal parts terrifying and awe-inspiring. But tonight he wasn't looking for trouble. He had stumbled into the bar to unwind, to blend into the crowd and forget for a few hours that he carried scars, both physical and emotional, that no amount of booze could erase. Aliens of all shapes and sizes filled the bar. There were Troxians with their scaly hides and triple sets of eyes, Chlorans who spoke in a melodic hum only translators could decipher, and the towering Traghosts with their imposing six-limbed frames. Despite the overwhelming diversity, one universal truth remained: humans were considered the weakest of all species in the galaxy. Small, fleshy, and fragile-looking, they were often the punchline of jokes, the butt of ridicule, and occasionally the target of misplaced aggression. A towering Traghoth named Vorthak loomed near the bar, his massive frame barely fitting beneath the low ceiling. His booming laughter echoed as he pointed at Jackson. "Look at this. A human in the nebula. Don't they know their kind can't handle real drinks?" His words drew laughter from the surrounding crowd, a cacophony of alien tones and guttural chuckles. Jackson didn't flinch. He took another sip of his drink, the blue liquid crackling as it hit his throat. He wasn't here to start a fight, though deep down he knew trouble would find him. It always did. "What's the matter, human?" Vorthak sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Too weak to respond? Or is your species only good at running away?" The laughter grew louder, and Jackson could feel the tension thickening. His shoulders tensed, but he remained calm. He'd been in worse situations. Much worse. "Leave him be," a smaller alien muttered, a Zalvian with shimmering insect-like wings. "Humans may be weak, but they're harmless." "Harmless?" Vorthak bellowed, slamming a massive fist onto the bar. "They're a disgrace to this galaxy. Always talking about their resilience and spirit. Bah. Let's see how resilient this one is." The bar fell silent as Vorthak approached Jackson, his footsteps shaking the floor. The Traghotha's 4 eyes glinted with cruel amusement. He loomed over the human, his shadow engulfing Jackson entirely. "Why don't you show us what you're made of, human?" Jackson set his glass down slowly, the faint hiss of the drink dissipating into the silence. He looked up at Vorthak, his eyes calm but piercing. "I'd rather not," he said evenly, his voice carrying a weight that made even the rowdiest patrons pause. Vorthak grinned, baring jagged, yellow teeth. "Oh, you don't have a choice." Before Jackson could respond, the Traghotha's massive hand shot forward, aiming to grab the human by the collar. But what happened next left the entire bar stunned. In a blur of motion, Jackson ducked, his movements impossibly quick. With a precision honed through years of combat training, he twisted Vorthak's arm, forcing the giant alien to stumble forward. In the same motion, Jackson delivered a calculated strike to the back of Vorthak's knee, sending the towering predator crashing to the floor. The bar erupted into chaos. Vorthak roared, more out of embarrassment than pain, and swung his massive arm at Jackson. But the human was already moving, his reflexes far beyond what the aliens had anticipated. Jackson sidestepped the attack, his movements fluid and deliberate. He didn't fight with brute strength, he didn't need to. Every strike, every dodge, every calculated blow was a masterclass in efficiency. The patrons watched in disbelief. Humans weren't supposed to be this lethal. They were supposed to be fragile, defenseless creatures barely capable of holding their own in a galaxy teeming with predators. But Jackson Cade was rewriting that narrative with every move he made. Vorthak, now furious and humiliated, bellowed and lunged at Jackson again. This time Jackson didn't hold back. He delivered a series of rapid strikes, one to the jaw, another to the ribs, and a final devastating kick to the chest. The Traghoth collapsed, his massive body shaking the ground as he hit the floor. Silence fell over the bar once more. Jackson adjusted his jacket, picked up his glass, and took another sip as if nothing had happened. His calm demeanor only added to the air of intimidation that now surrounded him. "That was impossible," a Cloran muttered, his melodic voice tinged with disbelief. "Humans aren't supposed to be that strong." "It's not strength," the Zalvian whispered, her wings trembling. "It's something else. Something terrifying." Vorthak groaned, struggling to stand, but Jackson placed a boot on the Traghotha's chest, holding him down effortlessly. He leaned in close, his voice low but firm. "Rule number 1, he said, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. "Never underestimate a human." The bar patrons exchanged uneasy glances. In that moment they realized something profound. Humans weren't the weakest species in the galaxy. They were something far more dangerous. Creatures who thrived under pressure, who adapted to any challenge and who, when pushed to their limits, became unstoppable. Jackson stepped away, allowing Vorthak to rise. The Traghoth, now humbled and nursing his wounds, muttered something unintelligible before retreating to a corner of the bar. The rest of the patrons kept their distance, their earlier bravado replaced with a newfound respect and fear for the lone human among them. As Jackson finished his drink and prepared to leave, the bartender, a grizzled Rigorian with a single glowing eye, leaned in. "You've made quite an impression," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "They won't forget this." Jackson smirked. "Good. Maybe next time, they'll think twice before picking a fight." With that, he walked out of the fractured nebula, leaving behind a room full of stunned aliens who would forever remember the night they learned the truth about humanity. Humans weren't prey. They were predators. And they were far deadlier than anyone had ever imagined. The aftermath of Jackson Cade's confrontation with Vorthak rippled through the fractured nebula like a shockwave. Whispers began to circulate among the bar's patrons, recounting every detail of the human's effortless victory. It wasn't just that Jackson had defeated Vorthak, it was how. The calculated strikes, the near-perfect reflexes, the calm composure in the face of overwhelming size and strength, it unnerved them all. For the first time in their lives, many of the patrons began to wonder if their assumptions about humans were catastrophically wrong. As Jackson strode through the dimly lit streets of the galactic hub, he could feel eyes on him. Alien onlookers, those who had either heard about or witnessed the encounter, stared with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Even in the diverse melting pot of species that the hub represented, a human who could take down a Traghoth wasn't just an anomaly, it was a paradigm shift. Jackson wasn't naive. He knew the incident at the bar would draw attention, and not all of it would be good. The galaxy was full of predators, and many wouldn't take kindly to the idea that a human could challenge their dominance. As much as he wanted to avoid more trouble, he also knew that trouble rarely gave him a choice. Sure enough, trouble found him. It started as a faint hum, a sound so subtle that most would have ignored it. But Jackson's military-honed instincts kicked in immediately. He stopped in his tracks, scanning his surroundings. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual bustle of the hub's nightlife conspicuously absent. The faint hum grew louder, transforming into the unmistakable sound of stealth hovercraft engines. A flash of movement in the corner of his eye confirmed his suspicions. 3 sleek, black hovercrafts emerged from the shadows, each piloted by figures clad in dark armor. Syndicate enforcers. The Syndicate was one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the galaxy, a shadowy conglomerate that thrived on fear and control. They ran the hub with an iron fist, and their enforcers were notorious for their ruthlessness. Jackson knew they'd likely been sent to deal with him after Vorthak's humiliation. The Traghoth, for all his bluster, was a known associate of the Syndicate, and they wouldn't let such an insult go unanswered. The hovercrafts encircled him, their engines emitting a low, menacing growl. One of the enforcers, a reptilian Vernak with glistening, scaled skin and a voice like gravel, stepped forward. "Human," the Vernak hissed, his yellow eyes narrowing. "You've made a grave mistake. The Syndicate doesn't take kindly to humiliation." Jackson remained calm, his hands at his sides. "I didn't humiliate anyone. Vorthak did that to himself." The Vernak snarled, revealing rows of sharp teeth. "You don't seem to understand your place in this galaxy. Humans are fragile. You're not supposed to fight back." Jackson tilted his head slightly, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Funny. That's what Vorthak said before I put him on the floor." The Vernak's snarl deepened, and he raised a clawed hand, signaling the other enforcers to prepare their weapons. Energy rifles hummed to life, their glowing barrels aimed squarely at Jackson. "Last chance, human," the Vernak growled. "Kneel and we might let you live." Jackson's smirk vanished, replaced by a steely expression. He took a slow step forward, his movements deliberate. "You should have done your homework before coming after me," he said, his voice low and measured. "Rule number 2, never bring a gun to a fight with a human." The Vernak scoffed. "And what's a human going to do against?" Jackson moved. In the blink of an eye, he closed the distance between himself and the nearest enforcer, a towering Frelkin with insectoid features. Before the Frelkin could react, Jackson disarmed him with a swift, brutal motion, snapping the rifle out of his hands and delivering a devastating elbow strike to the alien's head. The Frelkin crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Chaos erupted. The other enforcers opened fire, their energy blasts cutting through the air. But Jackson was already in motion, weaving through the barrage with agility that seemed almost inhuman. He used the fallen Frelkin's rifle as a shield, deflecting shots with precision before hurling the weapon like a spear into another enforcer's chest. The Vernac roared in frustration, charging at Jackson with claws extended. But Jackson was ready. He sidestepped the attack and delivered a crushing kick to the back of the Vernac's knee, forcing him to the ground. In one fluid motion, Jackson drew a compact, human-engineered combat knife from his belt and held it to the Vernac's throat. The remaining enforcer froze, their weapon trembling in their hands. The syndicate wasn't used to being outmatched, let alone by a lone human. Jackson leaned in close, his voice cold and unyielding. Rule number 3, humans don't fight fair. We fight to win. The Vernac's yellow eyes widened with genuine fear, a realization dawning upon him that he had grossly underestimated his opponent. Jackson didn't just survive, he thrived in situations where others would crumble. He released the Vernac, letting him collapse to the ground in a heap. The remaining enforcer dropped their weapon and fled, their hovercraft disappearing into the shadows. Jackson straightened, wiping a trickle of sweat from his brow. The fight had been intense, but he was far from exhausted. He glanced down at the Vernac, who was clutching his injured leg and glaring up at him with a mix of anger and fear. "Tell the syndicate to leave me alone," Jackson said, his tone firm. "And if they don't, well, let's just say Vorthak got off easy." The Vernac nodded weakly, too terrified to argue. Jackson turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the hub's labyrinthine streets. As he left, a small crowd of onlookers emerged from hiding. They had witnessed the entire confrontation, their expressions ranging from shock to awe. "He's not like the others," one of them whispered, a Zalvian with shimmering wings. "He's dangerous." Another, a squat Cloran, nodded solemnly. "Humans aren't what we thought they were. They're not fragile. They're predators." Word of the encounter spread quickly, reaching every corner of the galactic hub and beyond. For the first time, the galaxy began to see humans in a new light, not as weaklings to be pitted or ignored, but as a species capable of surviving, adapting, and thriving in even the most hostile environments. And as Jackson Cade disappeared into the night, the galaxy learned a lesson it would never forget. Underestimating a human was the last mistake anyone could afford to make. The syndicate was many things: ruthless, cunning, and above all, relentless. The moment their enforcers returned, battered and humiliated, the story spread like wildfire through the criminal network. It wasn't long before Jackson Cade's name found its way to the ears of the syndicate's leader, an enigmatic and cruel Rylon known only as Calthar. Calthar was notorious for his cruelty and efficiency, ruling his vast empire of crime with an iron fist. He was the type to respond to defiance with overwhelming force. But this time he hesitated. The reports from his enforcers weren't just troubling, they were alarming. They described a human who had not only outmatched them in combat but had done so with a calm, almost predatory precision that defied all expectations. Humans were supposed to be weak, Calthar muttered to himself, reviewing the footage from a covert drone that had captured the encounter. His mandibles clicked in agitation as he replayed Jackson's movements. They were fluid, controlled, and terrifyingly efficient. This wasn't the behavior of prey. For the first time in years, Calthar felt an unfamiliar emotion creeping into his chest: unease. Jackson, meanwhile, was preparing for the inevitable. He knew the syndicate wouldn't take his warning seriously. Organizations like theirs didn't back down because of a single incident. They would send more enforcers, better equipped and more determined than before. So Jackson took precautions. He spent the next few days navigating the labyrinthine alleys of the galactic hub, gathering supplies and making quiet alliances with those who had no love for the syndicate. While most of the hub's denizens were terrified of the crime syndicate, a few brave souls recognized an opportunity in Jackson. One of them was Zara, a Zenari engineer who had grown up under the syndicate's oppressive thumb. She approached Jackson cautiously, her luminous, cat-like eyes reflecting the faint glow of the neon signs that lit the hub streets. "I heard what you did to Vorthak," she said, her voice low. Jackson didn't respond immediately, studying her with the same sharp, assessing gaze he'd used on the syndicate enforcers. After a moment he nodded. "And?" Zara glanced around nervously before leaning in closer. "I can help you. The syndicate's got their claws in this entire hub, but not everyone likes it. There's a lot of us who'd like to see them taken down, but we need someone to lead the charge. Jackson raised an eyebrow. I'm not here to start a revolution, he said flatly. No, Zara agreed, but you've already lit the spark. The syndicate's scared of you whether they admit it or not. If you're willing to stand up to them, others will follow. For a moment, Jackson considered her words. He had no interest in becoming a hero or a leader, but he also knew that taking on the syndicate alone was a losing battle. Strength in numbers was a universal truth, and if he wanted to survive, he'd need allies. Fine, he said finally. But if we're going to do this, we do it my way. Zara nodded eagerly, her tail flicking with anticipation. Whatever you need. It didn't take long for the syndicate to make their next move. 3 nights after Jackson's initial encounter with the enforcers, Coulter deployed a full strike team to the hub. This wasn't a ragtag group of thugs. These were elite operatives, equipped with state-of-the-art weaponry and trained in advanced combat tactics. Their mission was simple: eliminate Jackson Cade and make an example of him. But Jackson was ready. With Zara's help, he had turned the lower levels of the hub into a battlefield of his own design. The narrow alleys and abandoned warehouses became traps, each one carefully set to exploit the syndicate operatives' overconfidence. The first ambush came in the form of an electromagnetic pulse that disabled the syndicate's hovercrafts, forcing them to proceed on foot. As the operatives fanned out, searching for their target, Jackson struck from the shadows. He moved like a phantom, striking swiftly and disappearing before the operatives could retaliate. One by one they fell, taken down by a combination of lethal precision and improvised traps. Zara and a handful of her allies provided support, using their technical expertise to monitor the syndicate's movements and relay crucial information to Jackson. The strike team's leader, a hulking Zorathian with cybernetic enhancements, quickly realized they were outmatched. But retreat wasn't an option. Coulter had made it clear that failure was unacceptable. Spread out, the Zorathian barked, his voice booming through the darkened alleys. Flush him out. He's just one human. But that was their mistake. Jackson wasn't just one human. He was a soldier, a survivor, and a predator in a galaxy that had long since dismissed his kind as prey. And he wasn't about to let the syndicate forget it. The final confrontation came in an abandoned docking bay on the outskirts of the hub. The remaining syndicate operatives had regrouped there, hoping to set a trap of their own. But Jackson had anticipated their plan. As the operatives waited in tense silence, scanning the shadows for any sign of their target, a low, mocking voice echoed through the bay. You should have stayed home, Jackson called out, his tone calm and taunting. The operatives spun around, their weapons trained on the darkness. But Jackson was already moving. He emerged from the shadows with a flash of steel, his combat knife slicing through the air. What followed was a whirlwind of chaos. Jackson's movements were a blur, his strikes precise and devastating. The operatives, despite their training and equipment, couldn't keep up. Within minutes, the docking bay was littered with their incapacitated forms. The Zorathian leader was the last to fall. He fought fiercely, his cybernetic enhancements giving him a significant advantage in strength and speed. But Jackson was relentless, exploiting every weakness and outmaneuvering the towering alien at every turn. When the Zorathian finally collapsed, defeated and disarmed, Jackson stood over him, breathing heavily but victorious. Tell Coulter, Jackson said, his voice cold and unwavering, that humans don't roll over. And if he sends anyone else after me, I'll take the fight to him next. The Zorathian nodded weakly, too battered to argue. As Jackson walked away, Zara and her allies emerged from the shadows, their expressions a mix of awe and determination. The syndicate had underestimated them, just as they had underestimated Jackson. And now they were learning the hard way that humans weren't just survivors, they were fighters. And they didn't back down. Word of the docking bay massacre spread across the galactic hub like wildfire. Merchants whispered the story in crowded markets, engineers repeated it over drinks in dimly lit cantinas, and even the syndicate spies couldn't suppress the tale of the human who had stood against the syndicate and won. For Coulter, the story was not just an embarrassment, it was a threat to his very existence. The syndicate thrived on fear, and if they failed to instill that fear, their empire would crumble. But fear was no longer on their side. Instead, the hub's denizens, long oppressed by the syndicate, began to see hope in the form of Jackson Cade. Coulter could not afford to let that hope flourish. He decided to end things himself. The syndicate's retaliation came swiftly and brutally. Coulter arrived on the hub with a personal armada, his flagship casting an ominous shadow over the station. He broadcast his ultimatum to every corner of the hub, his deep, guttural voice laced with menace. "Jackson Cade, your defiance ends now. Surrender yourself, or I will raise this station to its foundations." The message was clear, and so was the timer ticking down on every screen. 10 hours until the Syndicate's armada would fire. Jackson, hiding in the lower levels with Zara and their growing band of rebels, watched the broadcast with a grim expression. "He's trying to bait me," Jackson said, pacing the room. "You can't face him alone," Zara said, her voice trembling with worry. "He's bringing an entire fleet." Jackson stopped and turned to her, his eyes hard but not unkind. "I'm not planning to. This isn't just my fight anymore. It's all of ours." The next few hours were a flurry of activity. With Zara's technical expertise and the rebels' intimate knowledge of the station, they began devising a plan. Jackson wasn't just a fighter, he was a strategist. He knew the Syndicate relied on overwhelming force, but they underestimated the one thing they couldn't buy or threaten: the will of the people. Under his guidance, the rebels prepared the hub for war. Engineers rigged explosive traps throughout key areas, smugglers secured hidden caches of weapons, and workers turned cargo haulers into makeshift barricades. The station itself became their weapon. But Jackson knew that wouldn't be enough. Coulter's flagship was too powerful to defeat with improvised weapons. That's where Zara's brilliance came in. She proposed hacking into the station's defense grid, ancient and mostly dormant but still capable of firing devastating plasma bursts. If they could activate it, they'd have a chance to cripple the Syndicate's armada. "It's a long shot," Zara admitted as she explained the plan. "The grid hasn't been used in decades. There's no guarantee it'll even power up." "It doesn't have to be perfect," Jackson replied. "It just has to work long enough." When the 10-hour timer reached zero, Coulter's armada opened fire. Massive energy blasts rained down on the station's outer shields, causing the structure to shudder violently. Civilians screamed and scattered, but Jackson and his rebels stood firm. "Now?" Zara shouted, her fingers flying across a console as she activated the defense grid. For a moment nothing happened. Then, with a deafening hum, the station's ancient cannons came to life. Plasma bursts erupted from hidden turrets, catching the Syndicate's ships off guard. The first wave of fighters was obliterated in seconds, and the flagship itself took a direct hit to its shields. Coulter roared in fury, slamming his claws into his command console. "Send in the ground forces. I want Cade alive." The Syndicate's troops began deploying to the hub's surface, but they were met with fierce resistance. Jackson led the charge, his combat instincts honed to perfection as he coordinated ambushes and counterattacks. The rebels fought with a ferocity born of desperation and hope, using every advantage the station's labyrinthine layout offered. The battle raged for hours, but the turning point came when Zara managed to disable the Syndicate's communications. Without orders from Coulter, the Syndicate's troops became disorganized, easy prey for the rebels' coordinated strikes. Realizing the situation was slipping out of his control, Coulter made his move. He descended to the station himself, flanked by his personal guard, a terrifying unit of heavily armored warriors. Jackson knew this was the final confrontation. He met Coulter in the station's central plaza, the hub's largest open space. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burned metal. Around them, the rebels and Syndicate forces continued to clash, but all eyes turned to the two figures at the center. Coulter towered over Jackson, his mandibles clicking in contempt. "You've been a thorn in my side for long enough, human. I'll end this myself." Jackson didn't respond with words. He raised his weapon, a battered but reliable pulse rifle, and fired. The fight was brutal and unrelenting. Coulter's strength and size gave him the upper hand, but Jackson's speed and cunning kept him in the fight. They traded blows, their movements a deadly dance of survival and vengeance. Coulter lunged, his claws slashing through the air, but Jackson sidestepped and drove his combat knife into the alien's side. Coulter roared in pain but retaliated with a crushing backhand that sent Jackson sprawling. For a moment, it seemed as though Coulter had won. He loomed over Jackson, his claws raised for the killing blow. "You fought well, human," Coulter sneered, "but you were always destined to lose." Jackson, battered and bloodied, smirked up at him. "You forgot one thing." Coulter hesitated, confused. "Humans," Jackson said, activating a hidden detonator, "don't fight fair." A series of explosions ripped through the plaza, targeting the supports of the overhanging structures. The ceiling collapsed, and Jackson rolled to safety just in time as tons of debris crushed Coulter and his guard. With Coulter dead and his forces in disarray, the Syndicate's grip on the station crumbled. The remaining troops surrendered and the rebels seized control. For the first time in years the galactic hub was free. As the dust settled, Jackson stood amidst the rubble, his face grim but victorious. Zara approached him, her expression a mix of relief and admiration. "You did it," she said. "We did it," Jackson corrected, looking out at the cheering rebels. But deep down he knew this was just the beginning. The Syndicate's empire stretched far beyond this station, and others would come to fill the void Calther had left behind. Still, for the first time in a long while, Jackson felt a spark of hope. Humans might not be the strongest species in the galaxy, but they were survivors, fighters, and, when pushed, they were unstoppable. And now the galaxy knew it.